Francis Galton, the man who measured humanity, 1822 to 1911. Francis Galton was born into money and genius, the half-cousin of Charles Darwin, the child of prosperous Quakers who expected great things. He made them proud and uneasy at the same time. Gifted in mathematics and statistics, he wanted to turn Darwin's theory of natural selection into a tool for engineering people. If nature could filter species through fitness, he argued, why could society not do the same with its citizens? He called his idea eugenics, from the Greek for good birth. Galton believed that traits like intelligence, temperament, or even talent were heritable, and that the state should encourage the best to reproduce more and the unfit to reproduce less. It was not presented as cruelty, but as science, a logical extension of statistics and evolution, wrapped in Victorian faith in progress. Galton's laboratories pioneered fingerprinting, psychometrics, and data analysis. His politics turned those inventions into moral hierarchy. He wrote of selective breeding of humans as if it were simply a public health initiative. By the time he died, his ideas had spread through British academia and across the Atlantic, where they would fuel decades of state-sponsored sterilization and racial law. Galton saw himself as a humanitarian statistician. History remembers him as the philosopher who made arithmetic capable of apathy, the moment when numbers stopped counting lives and started test scoring them. Charles Davenport, the scientist who turned pedigrees into policy, 1866 to 1944. Charles Benedict Davenport was an American biologist who believed that biology could replace morality as the foundation for building a better nation. Trained at Harvard and once respected for his work in genetics, he saw heredity as the key to every social problem: poverty, crime, even immorality itself. In 1910, he founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, a bureaucracy dedicated to cataloging American families by bloodline. Field workers collected records on marriages, health, and mental capacity, scoring citizens as fit or unfit for the future. Davenport's charts connected alcoholism to weak stock and generosity to strong stock. His reports shaped laws that permitted forced sterilization of tens of thousands and helped convince Congress to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. He called it applied biology. Critics later called it state racism with a clipboard. When Nazi scientists quoted him in the 1930s, Davenport said only that they'd taken his work too far. By the time he died, the Eugenics Record Office had been discredited and shut down, a monument to what can happen when science forgets its soul.
Carl Pearson, the mathematician who taught the state to count souls, 1857 to 1936. Carl Pearson was a statistical visionary. He invented the correlation coefficient and laid the foundation for modern data science. But his talent was also his danger. A fervent disciple of Francis Galton, Pearson believed numbers could solve morality itself. He merged mathematics with eugenics to prove that some groups were innately superior to others, and that statistics could quantify destiny. As head of the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics at University College London, he used biometry to argue for racial hierarchies and compulsory population control. To his followers, he made science seem objective. To history, he proved how easily objectivity can be weaponized. Pearson saw society as a math problem awaiting optimization. He never asked what got deleted to make the equation clean. Brilliant enough to map chance for an age of uncertainty, he became the unknowing blueprint for every technocrat who measures justice in percentages and calls it progress. Madison Grant, the apostle of racial hierarchy, 1865 to 1937. Madison Grant was a New York lawyer and aristocrat who combined his love for wildlife conservation with a faith in racial engineering. A founder of the Bronx Zoo and the Save the Whales movement before the phrase existed, he believed every species, including human races, had to be managed and protected from degeneration. In 1916, he published The Passing of the Great Race, a book that described Nordic people as the pinnacle of civilization and warned that immigration and intermarriage would erase their superiority. The book was wildly popular among America's elite and quoted by politicians to pass the Immigration Act of 1924. Adolf Hitler later called it his Bible. Grant saw himself as a scientist defending nature. What he defended was elitism disguised as ecology. He proved that idealism and violence can speak the same grammar when they use the word purity. By the time the world realized where his logic led, his ideas had already become law on 2 continents. Herbert Spencer, the gentleman who made cruelty respectable, 1820 to 1903. When Charles Darwin introduced natural selection, Herbert Spencer gave it a moral twist. He claimed the phrase survival of the fittest and turned biology into a social creed. If nature favored the strong, humanity should too. To him, poverty, disease, and failure were not injustices to correct, but natural filters to respect. Spencer's work, Social Statics and the Study of Sociology, preached that aid to the poor only interfered with evolutionary progress. His lectures spread through Victorian England and the United States, where industrialists used his ethics to brand greed as moral discipline. He was not a racist firebrand like Grant. His tone was philosophical, civilized, and utterly deadly. By making indifference sound scientific, Spencer taught a century that evolution could justify anything. His legacy is the most polite form of violence, the kind that smiles and calls suffering progress. R.A. Fisher, the genius who refused to let go of eugenics, 1890 to 1962. Ronald Aylmer Fisher was one of the greatest statisticians of the 20th century, a brilliant mathematician whose work on probability and genetic inheritance built the foundation for modern biology. He gave science the F-test, analysis of variance, and the mathematical synthesis of Mendel and Darwin. But behind that brilliance was an ideological loyalty to eugenics that he never abandoned. Fisher saw controlled breeding as simply another branch of applied genetics. He supported Britain's eugenic society for decades and defended its principles even after Nazi atrocities had turned the word to poison. To him, the issue was mathematical, not moral. If certain genes promoted health or intelligence, it was rational to favor them. He insisted science should not be blamed for politics. History disagreed. His methods advanced truth, but his faith in statistical purity showed how numbers can become an alibi for blindness. Fisher proved that genius without empathy is just calculation with a pulse.
Julian Huxley, the humanist who tried to rebrand eugenics, 1887 to 1975. Grandson of Darwin's ally, T.H. Huxley, and brother to novelist Aldous, Julian Huxley moved through the 20th century as both scientist and philosopher. He was the first Director General of UNESCO and helped write the organization's founding charter on education and human rights. Yet in his earlier career, he too believed in eugenics, not as racial tyranny, but as planned evolution. After World War II, when the word became toxic, Huxley coined evolutionary humanism. He argued that biological knowledge could guide human progress without the crude brutality of racial hierarchy. He advocated education and voluntary responsibility over coercion. It was a more ethical face on the same old dream of improvement. Huxley remains a paradox, the UN visionary who also believed humanity should edit itself. He sincerely wanted a better future. He just never asked who would qualify for it.
Margaret Sanger, the reformer who crossed a line, 1879 to 1966. Margaret Sanger is remembered as the American pioneer of birth control, a nurse who risked prison to give women information about contraception when it was banned as obscene. Her activism helped create Planned Parenthood and change the course of women's rights, yet the same cause drew her toward the language of eugenics. She saw limiting births among the poor and the sick not only as freedom for women, but as a way to improve society. Through the 1920s and 30s, she shared stages with figures from the American Eugenics Society and wrote essays that spoke of weeding out the unfit while condemning coerced sterilization. Sanger believed family planning could prevent suffering. History heard something darker. Her work was twisted by racial and class agendas she did not fully see. Today, she is a contested symbol, hero to those who see a rebel for women's autonomy, villain to those who see elitism in the roots of her movement. Margaret Sanger embodies the truth behind many reformers. Intentions save nobody once ideas learn how to misbehave.
Oswald Spengler, the philosopher of civilizational survival, 1880 to 1936. Oswald Spengler was less a scientist than a prophet of decline. In 1918, he published The Decline of the West, arguing that cultures are like organisms. They are born, flourish, age, and must either die or renew themselves through struggle. To him, liberal democracy and cosmopolitanism were symptoms of civilizations growing weak. He described this Darwinism of cultures as philosophy, not race science, but his language of decay and renewal fed European nationalists starved for myth. Nazi thinkers borrowed his phrases, even as Spengler himself criticized Hitler for vulgarity and violence. What he called the cycle of civilization, they turned into a blueprint for racial war. Spengler died before Europe caught up to his pessimism. He wanted to warn a civilization about entropy. Instead, he handed its enemies a manual. His case shows that ideas don't need their author's consent to commit crimes.
Houston Stewart Chamberlain was an English intellectual who fell in love with Germany and with German myth. Married to the daughter of composer Richard Wagner, he merged Wagner's romantic nationalism with pseudoscience to forge a new creed, history as a struggle between superior and inferior races. His two-volume book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, 1899, claimed that the Aryan race was the source of all culture and moral genius, while others were degenerative forces pulling Europe down. The book became a bestseller among German elites and a pillar of Völkisch ideology that fed early Nazism. Kaiser Wilhelm II called Chamberlain his spiritual guide, and Hitler visited him on his deathbed to pay tribute. Chamberlain believed that the German people were the Aryan race's most pure manifestation and advanced the theory that Jews were either an aberration of the Aryan race or that another fallen race was a Kree material used by the devil to forge a human form and take over the world.
Hans F.K. Gunther wasn't a general or a politician, he was a teacher, and that made him more dangerous. Trained as an anthropologist and classicist, he devoted his academic career to measuring human difference and assigning it meaning. His books on racial typology from the 1920s and 1930s laid out detailed tables of skull shapes, nose angles, and skin tones, declaring some noble, others decadent. Germany's Nazis found his ideas ready-made for policy. His Rassenkunde des deutschen Volkes, or Racial Science of the German People, became required reading in schools and police training centers. Gunther earned the nickname the Race Pope, a title he wore with academic pride as his science justified laws on marriage, immigration, and persecution. After 1945, his career did not collapse like the regime he had served. He retired quietly, publishing essays that reframed his work as Anthropology Misunderstood. Gunther proved that the most terrifying forms of cruelty can come not from hatred in a uniform, but from certainty in a lecture hall, a mind so obsessed with classifying humanity that it forgot to belong to it.
Alfred Plotz, the father of racial hygiene, 1860 to 1940. Alfred Plotz was a German physician who believed he had found a way to apply biology to morality. In 1895, he coined the term Rassenhygiene, racial hygiene, arguing that a nation must protect genetic health the way a doctor protects a patient. To him, poor and sick people were not victims, they were symptoms of a species allowed to degenerate. Plotz and his circle founded journals and societies that gave social Darwinism an aura of laboratory precision. What started as paper theories of fitness moved into policy: marriage licenses for the healthy, sterilization for the defective, and eventually state-sponsored purification programs that Germany would later perfect under Nazism. When the Third Reich rose, Plotz was an old man watching his ideas become law. He never repented. He called it the fulfillment of science. His life shows how easily a doctor's promise to heal can be rewritten as a license to harm, and how a nation can vote for a diagnosis that kills.
Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher they twisted, 1844 to 1900. Nietzsche himself was no eugenicist. He rejected state control and hated nationalism. Yet after his death, his sister Elizabeth and fellow racial theorists ransacked his words to justify their own ideology. The Nietzschean Übermensch, his symbol for self-overcoming, for becoming one's own creator, was flattened into a blueprint for selective breeding and Aryan supremacy. Under the Nazis, his photographs hung near those of Bismarck and Hitler. His writings were required reading for students of racial soul. In truth, Nietzsche despised anti-Semites and called any dogma of purity a sign of spiritual decay. But in a decade hungry for authority, nuance was irrelevant. His aphorisms were gutted for slogans. The lesson is as modern as ever. Genius cannot control its echo. A philosopher who preached self-creation became the mascot for people who destroyed others in his name, proof that even truth can be weaponized once the world decides what it wants to hear.
H.G. Wells, The Progressive Dream with a Dark Edge, 1866 to 1946. H.G. Wells is remembered as the father of science fiction, a visionary who imagined time machines and alien invasions. Less known is how his belief in scientific progress bled into belief in scientific control. In books like Anticipations and A Modern Utopia, he wrote openly that humanity should take charge of its own evolution, that those who failed to adapt might need to be discouraged from multiplying. To Wells, this was not hatred but hygiene, a way to save civilization from overcrowding and ignorance. He believed a rational elite could plan the future as easily as it built railways, a technocratic faith shared by many Edwardians who mistook compassion for design. He later repented, calling eugenics an idiot's dream, but the ideas had already escaped his pages. Wells proved that good intentions wear the same tone as tyranny when spoken in the language of efficiency.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the judge who made cruelty law. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was not a fringe theorist, but a lion of American law, a celebrated Civil War veteran, a Harvard scholar, and for 3 decades a Supreme Court justice. He was admired for his legal mind, which he used to write one of the most brutal sentences in the court's history. In 1927, he wrote the majority opinion in Buck v. Bell, a case that legalized the forced sterilization of a young woman named Carrie Buck, who the state had deemed feeble-minded. His ruling was not a reluctant concession, but a ringing endorsement of eugenic logic. Dismissing her rights with a stroke of his pen, Holmes declared for the court, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime,